Hey Guy, welcome back. Tonight we journey into the deep past, to a time when the world was younger, when the very foundations of civilization were being laid stone by laborious stone. We often look to the brilliant light of ancient Greece as the dawn of the world we know, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and drama. But the light of Athens and Sparta did not ignite in a vacuum. It was kindled from the embers of far older fires, from colossal empires and ingenious cultures that rose, flourished, and crumbled to dust long before the first hoplite ever polished his shield. These are the forgotten empires, the civilizations. Before the Greeks, whose names now whisper to us from fractured clay tablets and the weathered ruins of immense, abandoned cities, we will travel to the land between the rivers, to the shores of the Mediterranean and beyond, to uncover the stories of the Sumerians, the Hittites, the Minoans, and others who shaped humanity in ways we are only beginning to understand. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our journey into the world before the Greeks begins in a sun-scorched, unforgiving landscape, a flat, alluvial plain nestled between two great rivers. The Greeks would later call this land Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Today, much of it lies within the borders of modern Iraq. It is here, in the southern part of this plain, in a region called Sumer, that the first true sparks of civilization ignited, creating a blueprint for humanity that would be copied, adapted, and built upon for thousands of years. The Sumerians were the pioneers, the inventors of the city, the creators of writing, the first lawmakers, and the first to gaze at the heavens and see not just stars, but a cosmic drama played out by a pantheon of powerful, unpredictable gods. The origins of the Sumerians are shrouded in mystery. Their language, a complex tongue unrelated to any other known language, provides no clues as to where they came from. Some scholars believe they were indigenous people who had inhabited the marshes of southern Mesopotamia for millennia, while others suggest they were migrants who arrived sometime around 5500 BCE, bringing with them the secrets of irrigation. Whatever their origin, by the 4th millennium BCE, they had achieved something unprecedented. The southern Mesopotamian plain was a land of harsh contrasts. It had fertile soil, but received little rainfall, and was prone to violent, unpredictable floods. Survival depended on controlling the water. The Sumerians were the first to master this challenge on a grand scale. They engineered a complex network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs to divert the river water, turning the arid plains into a checkerboard of lush, productive farmland. This mastery of irrigation was the key that unlocked their civilization. It led to agricultural surpluses, meaning that for the first time, not everyone had to be a farmer. Society could diversify. This surplus was the seed from which the city grew. As agricultural techniques improved and populations expanded, small villages coalesced into the world's first true urban centers. By 3000 BCE, Sumer was a land of a dozen or more independent city-states, each with its own patron god and its own ruling dynasty. Cities like Uruk, Ur-Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur became bustling hubs of trade, craftsmanship, and religious devotion. At the heart of each city stood the most iconic piece of Sumerian architecture, the ziggurat. These were massive, stepped pyramids, built from mud bricks, with a temple or shrine at the summit. The ziggurat was not a tomb like the Egyptian pyramids. It was a man-made mountain, a staircase to heaven, designed to bridge the gap between the earthly and divine realms. It was the physical and spiritual center of the city, a constant, visible reminder of the power of the patron god who owned the city and all its inhabitants. Life in a Sumerian city was a vibrant, noisy affair. A visitor would walk through narrow, winding streets, past windowless mud brick houses packed tightly together. They would see artisans in their workshops, potters shaping clay on the world's first potter's wheels, metal workers casting tools and weapons from bronze, and weavers creating textiles from wool. The marketplace would be a cacophony of sounds and smells, with traders bartering for grain, livestock, pottery, and imported luxuries like wood from Lebanon, stone from Oman, and lapis lazuli from the distant mountains of Afghanistan. The Sumerians were skilled merchants, and their trade networks were extensive, connecting the Mesopotamian plain to the wider world. Perhaps the most significant and enduring invention of the Sumerians was writing. As their society grew more complex, they needed a way to keep track of goods, manage resources, and administer their burgeoning cities. The solution was cuneiform. It began as a system of pictographs, simple drawings of objects, but evolved into a sophisticated script of wedge-shaped marks impressed onto wet clay tablets with a reed stylus. The oldest known examples of writing, found at Uruk and dating to around 3200 BCE, are administrative texts, lists of rations, inventories of goods, and records of land sales. Writing was born from accounting, but once invented it was quickly adapted for other purposes. The Sumerians began to write down their history, their laws, their scientific observations, and most importantly, their literature. They composed hymns to their gods, proverbs, fables, and epic poems. The most famous of these, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells the story of a legendary king's quest for immortality, is one of the oldest works of literature in the world and contains a story of a great flood that predates the biblical account of Noah by centuries. Sumerian society was rigidly hierarchical. At the very top was the king, or Lugal, who acted as the chief priest and the earthly representative of the city's patron god. He was responsible for leading the army in battle, maintaining the temples and canal systems, and ensuring justice. Below him were the priests, who wielded enormous power as the intermediaries between the people and the gods. They controlled vast tracts of temple land and managed the city's granaries. Then came the scribes, the educated elite, who mastered the complex cuneiform script. Below them were the merchants, artisans, and farmers, who made up the majority of the population. At the very bottom were the slaves, who were typically prisoners of war or individuals who had fallen into debt. Sumerian religion permeated every aspect of life. They worshipped a pantheon of anthropomorphic gods and goddesses who represented the forces of nature and were often capricious and cruel. Anu was the god of the sky, Enlil the god of the wind and storms, and Enki the clever god of wisdom and fresh water. The welfare of the city depended on keeping its patron deity happy through constant prayer, sacrifice, and ritual. The Sumerians believed that humanity had been created from clay for the sole purpose of serving the gods, to relieve them of their cosmic chores. Life was precarious, and they viewed the afterlife as a gloomy, shadowy place, a land of no return. This pessimistic worldview likely stemmed from the harsh realities of their environment, where a sudden flood or a scorching drought could destroy a harvest and bring famine. For over a millennium, the Sumerian city-states dominated Mesopotamia. They were a constellation of rival powers, constantly vying for land, water rights, and political dominance. This led to endemic warfare, a recurring theme in their art and literature. Despite their shared culture and religion, they never unified into a single lasting Sumerian kingdom. By around 2350 BCE, their era of dominance began to wane. A new power was rising to their north, a Semitic-speaking people known as the Akkadians. Under their ambitious king, Sargon of Akkad, the Akkadians would conquer the Sumerian city-states, one by one, forging the world's first true empire and marking the end of the Sumerian period of history. However, the Sumerians did not simply vanish. Their culture, religion, and, most importantly, their system of writing were adopted and adapted by their conquerors. Cuneiform would continue to be used in Mesopotamia for another 2,000 years. The stories of their gods and heroes would be retold in Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian. The foundations they laid, the city, the law, the wheel, writing, the 60-second minute and 60-minute hour were their true legacy. They were the forgotten first architects of the civilized world, the brilliant, pessimistic, and endlessly creative people who took humanity's first, bold steps out of the prehistoric darkness. The long era of the independent Sumerian city-states, a patchwork of rivalrous but culturally unified urban centers, came to a dramatic and decisive end in the 24th century BCE. The agent of this change was a man of legendary ambition and obscure origins, a man who would forever alter the political landscape of the ancient world, Sargon of Akkad. By conquering the disparate cities of Mesopotamia and uniting them under a single banner, Sargon created something new, a political entity that historians now recognize as the world's first true empire. The Akkadian Empire was a short-lived but brilliant flash of power that set a new precedent for centralized rule and military conquest, a model that would be emulated by Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians for millennia to come. The story of Sargon himself is steeped in myth, a classic rags-to-riches tale that was likely embellished by his own propagandists. According to the legend, which bears a striking resemblance to the later story of Moses, Sargon was born in secret, the illegitimate son of a high priestess. To save him, his mother placed him in a reed basket waterproofed with bitumen and set him adrift on the Euphrates River. He was rescued by a gardener who raised him as his own son. As a young man, he rose to become the cupbearer to the king of Kish, one of the most powerful Sumerian cities. From this position of influence, through means that remain unclear, likely a palace coup, he seized power for himself. But Sargon's ambition could not be contained within the walls of a single city. He began a series of brilliant and ruthless military campaigns. His army was different from the Sumerian militias that preceded it. Sargon established a standing army of professional soldiers loyal only to him, not to a specific city or temple. He armed them with new weapons, including powerful composite bows and the bronze-tipped spear, and he drilled them in new tactics, particularly the use of massed phalanxes, oath spearmen to crush enemy formations. One by one, the ancient and proud cities of Sumer fell before him. He defeated Lugal-Zaci of Uruk, the most powerful Sumerian king of the time, capturing him in battle, putting him in a neck stock, and parading him in humiliation before the gate of the god Enlil in Nippur. Sargon's conquests extended far beyond Sumer. He marched his armies west to the Mediterranean Sea, north into Anatolia, modern Turkey, and east into Elam, modern Iran. He boasted, Sargon, the king of Kish, triumphed in 34 battles. He washed his weapons in the sea. He had united a vast and diverse territory, from the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, to the upper sea, the Mediterranean, under a single authority to govern this new multi-ethnic empire. Sargon established a new capital city, Akkad or Agada. Its exact location has never been found, making it a legendary lost city, but it was likely situated on the Euphrates between Sumer and the northern region of Mesopotamia. From Akkad, Sargon implemented a series of revolutionary administrative reforms. He bypassed the traditional authority of the local priests and nobles who had governed the city-states for centuries. Instead, he installed his own loyal Akkadian governors and officials to rule the conquered cities, ensuring their primary loyalty was to him and the imperial center, not to their local communities. He also standardized weights, measures, and, most importantly, the system of taxation, creating a unified economic zone that facilitated trade and funneled the wealth of the provinces back to the capital. The Akkadians were a Semitic-speaking people, and their language, Akkadian, gradually replaced Sumerian as the lingua franca of Mesopotamia. However, the Akkadians had immense respect for the older Sumerian culture. They did not erase it. They absorbed and adapted it. They adopted the cuneiform writing system for their own language, and Akkadian scribes preserved and copied Sumerian literary works, myths, and religious texts. The Sumerian gods were syncretized with their Akkadian counterparts. The Sumerian goddess Inanna, for example, became identified with the Akkadian Ishtar. This cultural fusion was a hallmark of the empire, a pragmatic blending of the old and the new. Sargon's most brilliant move in this regard was appointing his daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur, one of the most important religious centers in Sumer. Enheduanna was a remarkable figure in her own right, a skilled diplomat and a talented poet. She composed a series of beautiful hymns to the gods in Sumerian, and she is the first author in all of human history whose name is known to us. Her work helped to bridge the cultural gap between the Akkadian rulers and their Sumerian subjects. The Akkadian Empire reached its zenith under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who ruled from approximately 2254 to 2218 BCE. Naram-Sin was an even more audacious ruler than his grandfather. He expanded the empire's borders to their greatest extent and, in a move of unprecedented hubris, declared himself a living god, styling himself the god of Akkad. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, now in the Louvre Museum, perfectly captures This new ideology of divine kingship, it depicts a larger-than-life Naram Sin, wearing a horned helmet, a symbol of divinity, triumphantly crushing his enemies as he ascends a mountain towards the heavens. He is portrayed not as a servant of the gods, like the Sumerian kings, but as a god himself, a victorious, superhuman warrior. However, the very strengths of the Akkadian Empire, its centralization and its military focus, also contained the seeds of its downfall. The conquered cities, particularly the proud city-states of Sumer, chafed under Akkadian rule and frequently rose in rebellion. The empire required a massive military and administrative apparatus to suppress these revolts and defend its long borders, putting a constant strain on its resources. The divine pretensions of Naram Sin may have also alienated many of his subjects and offended the powerful priesthoods. The end of the empire came swiftly and catastrophically. According to later Mesopotamian chronicles, the fall of Akkad was a divine punishment for Naram Sin's hubris, particularly his alleged sacking of the holy city of Nippur, the seat of the god Enlil. The Curse of Akkad, a famous Mesopotamian poem, describes how the enraged gods abandoned the city, leaving it to be destroyed by invaders. The historical reality is more complex, but no less dramatic. The empire was weakened by internal rebellions and likely suffered from the effects of a severe, long-term drought that caused widespread famine and social collapse across the Near East. In this weakened state, the Akkadian heartland was overrun by invaders from the Zagros Mountains, a fierce tribal people known as the Gutians. The Gutians sacked the city of Akkad, and the empire collapsed into a new dark age of chaos and decentralization. The Akkadian Empire had lasted for less than 200 years, a brief but brilliant interlude in the long history of Mesopotamia. Yet its legacy was profound. Sargon and his descendants had shattered the old paradigm of the independent city-state and replaced it with a new ideal, the universal empire, a single state uniting all the peoples of the known world under one king. This powerful idea would haunt the Mesopotamian imagination for the rest of its history. Later rulers, from Hammurabi of Babylon to the mighty kings of Assyria, would look back to Sargon as the model of a great conqueror, an empire builder. The Akkadians were the first to prove that it was possible to rule over diverse peoples and vast territories from a single powerful center. They created the blueprint for empire, a political technology that would be refined and expanded upon for the next 4,000 years, leaving an indelible mark on the course of human history. Out of the chaos and fragmentation that followed the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and the subsequent Dark Age, under the Gutian invaders, a new period of Sumerian resurgence bloomed. The so-called Ur-3 dynasty, based in the ancient city of Ur, managed to re-establish a large, centralized state that was in many ways a successor to the Akkadian model, albeit with a renewed Sumerian cultural identity. However, this Sumerian revival was also to be short-lived. By the beginning of the second millennium BCE, new waves of Semitic-speaking peoples, known as the Amorites, were migrating into Mesopotamia from the west. These Amorite chieftains gradually infiltrated the region, establishing new dynasties in many of the old city-states. One of these cities, previously a minor and insignificant town on the banks of the Euphrates, was Babylon. Under its Amorite rulers, this humble city would rise to become the political and cultural center of the ancient world, a beacon of law, science, and literature whose name would echo through eternity. For the first century of its existence, the first dynasty of Babylon was just one of several competing powers in Mesopotamia. The political landscape was a complex web of alliances and rivalries with powerful kingdoms at Larsa, Ishnana, and Mari, all vying for supremacy. The man who would change everything was the sixth king of Babylon's dynasty, a ruler of extraordinary diplomatic skill and military prowess named Hammurabi, who ascended the throne in 1792 BCE. For the first 3 decades of his reign, Hammurabi played a patient game. He fortified his city, built up his army, and engaged in a shrewd series of shifting alliances, playing his rivals off against one another. He presented himself as a friend and ally to the powerful kings around him, all the while waiting for the opportune moment to strike. That moment came late in his reign. In a stunning series of swift and decisive campaigns, Hammurabi broke his alliances and turned on his former partners. He conquered the kingdom of Larsa to the south, annexing the old Sumerian heartland. He then marched his armies north, defeating the kingdoms of Ishnana and Mari, and destroying Mari's magnificent palace in the process. Within a few short years, Hammurabi had eliminated all his rivals and made himself the undisputed master of Mesopotamia. He had recreated the empire of Sargon, uniting the land from the Persian Gulf to the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates under the single authority of Babylon. Hammurabi is best remembered today not for his military conquests, but for his role as a lawgiver. His most famous legacy is the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest, longest, and best preserved legal texts from the ancient world. The code is inscribed on a magnificent black diorite stele over 7 feet tall, which was discovered by archaeologists in 1901. At the top of the stele is a relief carving depicting Hammurabi standing before the enthroned figure of Shamash, the Babylonian god of justice. Shamash is shown handing Hammurabi the rod and ring, symbols of divine authority, signifying that the laws themselves are not the king's arbitrary invention, but are a gift from the gods, divinely ordained. An immutable dot below the image, the stele, is covered in columns of dense cuneiform script, detailing nearly 300 laws. These are not abstract legal principles, but a series of if, then ... double quotes case laws, covering a vast range of subjects. There are laws concerning commerce and contracts, setting prices for goods and wages for laborers. There are laws governing marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption, providing a fascinating insight into Babylonian family life. There are laws dealing with property disputes, debt, and agriculture, including regulations for irrigation and liability for tenant farmers. And most famously, there are the laws dealing with assault, theft, and murder. These are governed by the principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, famously summarized as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. For example, Law 196 states, "If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out." However, the laws were not applied equally to all. The punishments varied dramatically depending on the social status of the perpetrator and the victim. Babylonian society was divided into 3 main classes: the Awilam, or upper class of nobles, and officials, the mushkinum, or commoners and free citizens, and the wardum, or slaves. If a nobleman put out the eye of another nobleman, his own eye would be put out. But if he put out the eye of a commoner, he only had to pay a fine of 1 mina of silver. This class-based system of justice was fundamental to the Babylonian worldview. The code also reveals a society that was, in some respects, surprisingly advanced. It provided a degree of state protection for the poor and vulnerable. It regulated interest rates to prevent usury and had provisions to protect debtors from being completely ruined. While patriarchal, it also granted women certain rights, including the right to own property, engage in business, and, in cases of mistreatment, initiate divorce. Hammurabi's code was not a revolutionary new legal system, but rather a compilation and rationalization of existing Sumerian and Akkadian laws. Its purpose was both practical and propagandistic, to create a unified legal standard across his diverse empire and to portray Hammurabi as a just and pious king, the shepherd of his people, who was personally tasked by the gods with bringing order and righteousness to the land. Under Hammurabi and his successors, Babylon became the cultural and intellectual capital of the ancient Near East. The city itself was magnificent, fortified with massive walls and filled with temples and palaces. The Babylonians were brilliant astronomers and mathematicians. Building on the foundations laid by the Sumerians, they developed a sophisticated sexagesimal, base 60 system of mathematics, which is the reason we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. They meticulously observed the movements of the planets and stars, believing they were omens from the gods that could predict the future. Their astronomical diaries, recorded over centuries, were incredibly detailed and accurate, laying the groundwork for later Greek and modern astronomy. Babylonian scribes also composed and preserved a rich body of literature, including the definitive version of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth. The empire of Hammurabi, often called the Old Babylonian Empire, did not long survive his death. His successors lacked his strength and vision, and the empire began to crumble under pressure from internal revolts and external enemies. The final blow came in 1595 BCE, when the city of Babylon was sacked in a surprise raid by a new power that had risen in Anatolia, the Hittites. The Hittite king, Rasili I, marched his army down the Euphrates, looted the city, and carried off the cult statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, a devastating act of sacrilege. The Hittites did not stay, but their raid shattered the power of Hammurabi's dynasty and plunged the region into another period of chaos. Yet the legacy of Babylon endured. The city itself would rise again and again, becoming the center of a new empire under Nebuchadnezzar II 1,000 years later. But the true legacy of the first Babylonian empire was the idea of law as a divinely sanctioned, public and essential pillar of civilization. The image of Hammurabi receiving the laws from the god of justice became one of the most powerful symbols of kingship in the ancient world. It established the principle that a ruler's legitimacy was based not just on military might, but on his ability to provide justice and order for his people. The Babylonians gave the world its first comprehensive legal code, a foundational document that recognized the state's responsibility to regulate the lives of its citizens and to create a society based on established written rules. While the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt were rising on the fertile plains of major river valleys, a new and formidable power was taking shape in the rugged mountainous highlands of central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. These were the Hittites, an Indo-European people who carved out a powerful empire that would challenge the might of the pharaohs and become one of the three great superpowers of the late Bronze Age. For centuries, their existence was known only from scattered, enigmatic references in the Old Testament. It was not until the early 20th century that archaeologists unearthed the ruins of their capital city, Hattusa, and discovered a vast royal archive of clay tablets. The decipherment of these tablets unlocked the secrets of a sophisticated, complex, and militaristic civilization that had been almost entirely lost to history. The Hittites were newcomers to Anatolia. They migrated into the region sometime in the 3rd millennium BCE, gradually settling among the indigenous Hattian people. By around 1650 BCE, a Hittite king named Hattusili I had established a strong, centralized kingdom with its capital at Hattusa. The city itself was a marvel of defensive engineering, built on a rocky citadel and protected by massive double walls, stone ramparts, and imposing gateways decorated with carved lions and sphinx. From this secure base, the Hittites began a period of dramatic military expansion. They were a warrior aristocracy, and their success was built on two key military innovations: the horse-drawn chariot and the mastery of iron. The Hittite war chariot was a revolutionary piece of military technology. It was lighter and faster than its Mesopotamian and Egyptian counterparts, with the axle moved to the middle of the platform for greater stability. Manned by a crew of 3, a driver, a warrior with a spear, and a shield-bearer, these chariots could be used as mobile archery platforms or as shock troops to smash into enemy infantry formations. A force of several hundred Hittite chariots sweeping across the plains was a terrifying and often unstoppable sight. Even more significantly, the Hittites were among the first major powers to master the art of iron smelting. The Anatolian mountains were rich in iron ore, but turning it into a usable metal was a difficult process that required much higher temperatures than bronze casting. The Hittite smiths perfected this technology, and while iron was initially a precious metal used for jewelry and ceremonial objects, they gradually began to forge weapons from it. An iron sword was harder and could hold a sharper edge than a bronze one, giving Hittite warriors a crucial advantage on the battlefield. The Hittites guarded the secret of iron-making closely, giving them a near monopoly on this new and powerful material for centuries. The Hittite kingdom was not a monolithic, centralized state like Egypt. It was a feudal confederation of vassal states, each ruled by a local king who swore an oath of fealty to the Hittite great king. The stability of the empire depended on the personal loyalty of these vassals and the king's ability to enforce his will through military might. This relationship was formalized through written treaties, and the Hittites were masters of diplomacy and international law. Their archives at Hattusa contained hundreds of these treaties, meticulously drafted legal documents that laid out the obligations of both parties. They specified the amount of tribute to be paid, the military support required of the vassal, and the procedures for resolving disputes. These treaties reveal a sophisticated understanding of international relations, based on a system of reciprocal obligations and sworn oaths before the gods. Hittite society was structured around the king, who was the supreme ruler, chief priest, and commander-in-chief of the army. Unlike the Egyptian pharaoh, the Hittite king was not considered a living god, at least not until after his death. He was the god's chosen steward on earth, responsible for maintaining order and prosperity. Hittite religion was a complex synthesis of their own Indo-European traditions and the beliefs of the various peoples they conquered, leading them to be known as the civilization of 1,000 gods. The storm god of Hatti-Teshub was the head of the pantheon, and his consort was the sun goddess Erina. The king's primary religious duty was to ensure the gods were properly worshipped through a constant cycle of festivals and rituals. Lest they become angry and punish the land with plague or famine. The Hittite Empire reached the peak of its power during the New Kingdom period, from roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE, under powerful and energetic kings like Sepuludema I. They expanded their influence south into Syria, pushing up against the northern frontier of the Egyptian Empire. This set the stage for one of the most famous confrontations of the ancient world. In 1274 BCE, the Hittite king Mawatali II and the ambitious young pharaoh Rameses II of Egypt met in battle near the Syrian city of Kadesh. Both sides commanded enormous armies with thousands of infantry and chariots. Rameses, believing he had the element of surprise, charged ahead of his main force and fell into a Hittite trap. His division was ambushed and nearly annihilated by a massive Hittite chariot charge. Only Rameses's personal bravery and the timely arrival of reinforcements saved him from a catastrophic defeat. In the end, the battle was a bloody stalemate. Rameses returned to Egypt and covered the walls of his temples with heroic reliefs claiming a great victory. But in reality, the Hittites retained control of Kadesh and the surrounding territory. The long-running conflict between the two superpowers was finally resolved not by war, but by diplomacy. Around 1258 BCE, Rameses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III negotiated the world's first known peace treaty between two great powers. Copies of the treaty have survived from both sides, a version inscribed in hieroglyphs on the walls of an Egyptian temple, and a cuneiform version on a clay tablet found at Hattusa. The treaty established a good peace and good brotherhood between the two empires, defined their mutual borders, and included a defensive alliance, promising that each would come to the other's aid if attacked by a third party. It was a landmark achievement in international relations and ushered in a period of relative peace and stability in the Near East. However, this golden age was not to last. Around 1200 BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean world was convulsed by a period of chaos and collapse known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. The exact causes are still debated, but likely include a combination of climate change, drought, famine, internal rebellions, and the mysterious invasions of the so-called Sea Peoples, a coalition of seaborne raiders who swept down the coast, destroying cities and disrupting trade routes. The highly centralized and interconnected economies of the Bronze Age empires were fragile. When the trade networks that brought them essential raw materials like copper and tin were severed, their economies collapsed. The Hittite Empire, already weakened by internal succession struggles and famine, could not withstand the onslaught. Their great capital at Hattusa was violently destroyed and abandoned, and the Hittite Empire vanished from history. For centuries the Hittites were a forgotten empire, their powerful kings and iron weapons buried beneath the soil of Anatolia. Their rediscovery in the 20th century was a revelation, adding a new and crucial piece to the puzzle of the ancient world. They were a bridge between the civilizations of Mesopotamia and the nascent cultures of the Aegean. Their legacy is seen in their pioneering use of iron, which would define the next technological age, their sophisticated system of international law and diplomacy, which recognized the need for peaceful coexistence between great powers, and their unique multicultural society that absorbed and adapted the traditions of the many peoples they ruled. The Hittites were the forgotten superpower of the Bronze Age, the iron warriors from the hills who rose to challenge the might of Egypt and whose eventual, sudden collapse serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of even the greatest civilizations. As the great territorial empires of the late Bronze Age, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Egyptians of the New Kingdom crumbled and collapsed around 1200 BCE, a new and different kind of power began to emerge from the coastal cities of the Levant. These were the Phoenicians, a Semitic-speaking people who inhabited a narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean coast, corresponding to modern-day Lebanon. They were not great conquerors who built a vast land empire. Instead, they were the world's greatest sailors, traders, and explorers, and they built a commercial empire of the sea that connected the entire Mediterranean basin. In doing so, they became the great cultural intermediaries of their age, and they gave the world one of its most important inventions, the phonetic alphabet. The land of Phoenicia was not well suited for large-scale agriculture. It was a mountainous region dominated by the Lebanon mountain range, which left only a thin coastal plain for settlement. However, the mountains were covered in one of the most valuable resources of the ancient world, the giant cedars of Lebanon. This strong, fragrant, and durable timber was highly prized for shipbuilding and the construction of temples and palaces, and it had been exported to Egypt and Mesopotamia for centuries. Facing the sea, with a series of excellent natural harbors and an abundance of high-quality timber for shipbuilding, the Phoenicians naturally turned to maritime trade as their primary source of wealth and survival. The collapse of the old empires was, in many ways, an opportunity for them. The power vacuum it created allowed their cities independent city-states like Byblus, Sidon, and Tyre to flourish as autonomous centers of commerce. The Phoenicians were master shipbuilders and navigators. They developed a new type of vessel, the baireme, a galley with 2 rows of oars, which was fast and maneuverable. They also built sturdy, round-hulled merchant ships with large square sails, capable of carrying heavy cargoes over long distances. They were the first sailors to regularly venture out of sight of land, navigating by the sun during the day and by the stars at night. They were particularly reliant on one star that was so reliable they called it the Phoenician star. We know it today as Polaris, the North Star, This skill allowed them to dominate the sea lanes of the Mediterranean. They sailed west to Cyprus, rich in copper, to the Aegean, trading with the emerging Greek city-states, to Egypt, supplying them with wine, oil, and timber, and even through the treacherous Straits of Gibraltar, which they called the Pillars of Heracles, into the vast, unknown waters of the Atlantic Ocean. They established trading posts in North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, and there is even evidence to suggest they may have circumnavigated Africa, a feat that would not be repeated for another 2,000 years. What were they trading? The Phoenicians were the ultimate middlemen, buying goods in one port and selling them for a profit in another. But they also produced their own highly sought-after luxury goods. They were skilled artisans, known for their fine metalwork, intricate ivory carvings, and beautiful glassware. But their most famous and valuable product was a rare and incredibly vibrant purple dye. This Tyrian purple, named after the city of Tyre, was extracted from the glands of thousands of tiny murex sea snails. The process was laborious and foul-smelling, requiring tens of thousands of snails to produce a single ounce of dye, making it astronomically expensive. The resulting color was a deep, permanent purple that did not fade, and it became the ultimate symbol of wealth, power, and royalty in the ancient world. The demand for Tyrian purple was so great that the Greeks called the Phoenicians the Phoenicians, which means purple people, the name by which they have been known ever since to manage their complex, far-flung trading network. The Phoenicians needed a simple and efficient way to keep records. The cuneiform script of Mesopotamia and the hieroglyphs of Egypt were incredibly complex, with hundreds of characters, and they took years of dedicated study to master. This was fine for a professional class of scribes, but it was impractical for a busy merchant trying to record a transaction in a foreign port. Building on earlier, less successful experiments with alphabetic writing in the Levant, the Phoenicians developed a revolutionary new system. Instead of using a symbol for each word or syllable, they created a system with just 22 symbols, where each symbol represented a single consonant sound. This was the world's first widely used phonetic alphabet. The simplicity of the Phoenician alphabet was its genius. A trader could learn all 22 characters in a matter of weeks, rather than years, and could then write down any word he could speak. It was a democratic revolution in writing, taking literacy out of the exclusive hands of the scribal elite and making it accessible to a much wider population. This powerful tool spread rapidly along their trade routes. In the 9th century BCE, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet to write their own language. They made one crucial modification. They adapted some of the Phoenician letters to represent vowel sounds, which were not written in the Phoenician system, creating the first true alphabet with both consonants and vowels. The Etruscans in Italy later adopted this Greek alphabet, and they in turn passed it on to the Romans. The Latin alphabet we use to write English today is a direct descendant of the one developed by those ancient Phoenician merchants. This is arguably their most important and enduring legacy. Phoenician religion was a continuation of the ancient Canaanite beliefs of the Levant. They worshipped a pantheon of gods that included Baal, the storm god, Melkart, the patron god of Tyre, who was associated with the sea and colonization, and Astarte, a powerful goddess of fertility and War, who was the equivalent of the Mesopotamian Ishtar. One of the most controversial aspects of their religion, at least according to their rivals and enemies like the Romans and the writers of the Old Testament, was the alleged practice of child sacrifice. Archaeological evidence from their colonies, particularly Carthage, has revealed cemeteries known as Tophets, containing the cremated remains of thousands of infants and young children buried in urns. While the extent and meaning of this practice are still hotly debated by scholars, some argue it was a last resort in times of extreme crisis. Others that the Tophets were simply cemeteries for children who died of natural causes. It became a key part of the later Greco-Roman propaganda that portrayed the Phoenicians as a cruel and barbaric people. The greatest of all Phoenician achievements was the founding of their colonies. These were not military outposts, but commercial centers, established to secure sources of raw materials and facilitate trade. The most famous and successful of these was the city of Carthage, founded on the coast of modern Tunisia in the late 9th century BCE by colonists from Tyre. Carthage grew to become a mighty power in its own right, a sprawling metropolis that controlled a vast commercial empire in the western Mediterranean. Long after the Phoenician homeland had fallen under the control of the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians, Carthage carried on the Phoenician legacy. It became the great rival of the rising Roman Republic, and their struggle for control of the Mediterranean, the Punic Wars, was one of the epic conflicts of the ancient world. The Phoenicians were a unique and often misunderstood civilization. They were not empire builders in the traditional sense, but their impact on the world was just as profound. They were the great connectors of the ancient world, their ships weaving a web of commerce and culture that stretched from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. They were fearless explorers who pushed the boundaries of the known world, and brilliant innovators who gave us the alphabet. While their own writings have largely perished, they wrote on perishable papyrus, not durable clay. Their legacy lives on in the letters we use every day, a silent testament to the ingenuity of the forgotten purple people of the sea. While the great empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt were flourishing on the mainland, a unique and brilliant civilization was rising on the island of Crete, a large, mountainous island strategically located in the heart of the Aegean Sea. This was the Minoan civilization, Europe's first great Bronze Age culture, named by the 20th century archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans after the legendary King Minos of Greek mythology. The Minoans were not Greeks, and they did not speak Greek. They were a distinct people with a vibrant and sophisticated culture, a love of beauty, and a maritime power that dominated the Aegean for centuries. Theirs was a civilization of magnificent palaces, stunning artwork, and enigmatic rituals, a world that was suddenly and catastrophically destroyed, leaving behind a mystery that continues to fascinate us to this day. The Minoan civilization emerged around 2700 BCE and reached its peak. Between 1700 and 1450 BCE, their wealth was based on trade. Crete's fertile soil produced valuable agricultural goods, including olive oil, wine, and saffron, which they exported throughout the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. Their ships, depicted in their art as sleek, single-masted vessels, sailed to Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Greek mainland, trading their goods for raw materials like copper, tin, gold, and ivory. This trade brought immense wealth back to the island, and this wealth was used to construct some of the most remarkable architectural complexes of the ancient world, the great Minoan palaces. The most famous of these is the Palace of Knossos, a sprawling, multi-storied complex that Evans painstakingly excavated and, controversially, partially reconstructed. Knossos was not just a royal residence. It was the administrative, religious, and economic center of the Minoan state. It was a labyrinthine structure with hundreds of interconnected rooms, corridors, and courtyards covering several acres. The palace had sophisticated features that were astonishing for their time, including advanced drainage systems with terracotta pipes for sanitation and runoff, light wells to illuminate the interior rooms, and grand staircases connecting the different levels. The walls were decorated with vibrant and beautiful frescoes, paintings that provide our most vivid glimpse into the Minoan world. These frescoes are unlike the stiff, formal art of Egypt or the warlike art of Mesopotamia. They are full of life, color, and movement. They depict scenes of nature, with dolphins leaping from the sea, birds flitting through reeds, and monkeys climbing rocks. They show elegant, fashionably dressed men and women with cinched waists and elaborate hairstyles, participating in processions and festivals. One of the most famous and enigmatic of these frescoes depicts the ritual of bull leaping, where both young men and women are shown somersaulting over the back of a charging bull. This dangerous and acrobatic feat was clearly a central part of Minoan ritual life, though its exact meaning remains a subject of debate. Was it a religious ceremony, a rite of passage, or a form of public entertainment? Whatever its purpose, the bull was clearly a powerful and sacred animal in Minoan culture. A symbol of fertility and strength, the palace at Knossos also contained vast storage areas with giant pottery jars, known as pithoi, capable of holding enormous quantities of olive oil, wine, and grain. This points to the palace's role as a center for redistribution, where the agricultural surplus of the island was collected, stored, and then doled out to the population. The palace workshops produced high-quality luxury goods, including delicate, eggshell-thin pottery, beautifully carved stone vessels, and intricate gold jewelry. The Minoans were also a literate people. Archaeologists at Knossos discovered a large archive of clay tablets inscribed with 2 different scripts. The older script is a form of hieroglyphics, but the more common one is a linear script known as Linear A. Despite decades of effort by scholars, Linear A has not yet been deciphered. We can read the symbols, but the underlying language remains a mystery. This is one of the great frustrations of Minoan studies. We can see their world through their art and archaeology, but we cannot hear their voices or read their thoughts. Minoan religion seems to have been focused on the worship of a powerful mother goddess, often depicted with snakes coiled around her arms, a symbol of fertility and regeneration. Unlike the male-dominated pantheons of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the supreme deity of the Minoans appears to have been female. Priestesses rather than priests seem to have played the leading role in religious ceremonies. Worship took place not in massive separate temples, but in small shrines within the palaces and in sacred caves and on mountaintops. The absence of monumental temples, combined with the peaceful, nature-oriented themes of their art, has led some scholars to characterize Minoan society as a relatively peaceful and egalitarian matriarchy, though this view is likely an oversimplification. One of the most striking features of the Minoan palaces is their lack of fortifications. Unlike the heavily walled citadels of the Greek mainland or the fortified cities of Mesopotamia, the Minoan palaces were open and accessible. This suggests that the Minoans lived in a state of relative peace and security, a pax Minoica, or Minoan peace. Their security did not depend on land-based armies and walls, but on their powerful navy, which controlled the seas and protected the island from invasion. The Greek historian Thucydides later wrote of the legendary King Minos, who was the first person to organize a navy and who cleared the sea of pirates. This naval dominance allowed Minoan culture to flourish undisturbed for centuries. Then, around 1450 BCE, disaster struck. The great palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea were all destroyed and burned. The cause of this sudden and violent collapse has been the subject of intense debate for decades. For a long time, the leading theory was a massive volcanic eruption. On the nearby island of Thera, modern Santorini, about 70 miles to the north. This eruption, one of the largest in human history, would have sent massive tsunamis crashing into the coast of Crete and covered the island in a thick layer of volcanic ash, devastating agriculture and crippling the Minoan fleet. While the eruption was certainly a major event that disrupted Minoan society, more recent archaeological evidence suggests that the final destruction of the palaces came several decades later. The current leading theory is that the Minoans, weakened by the aftermath of the Theran eruption, were conquered by invaders from the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans. Evidence for this comes from the discovery at Knossos of a different type of writing on clay tablets dating from the final period of the palace's occupation. This script, known as Linear B, was deciphered in the 1950s by Michael Ventris and was revealed to be an early form of the Greek language. It seems that the Mycenaeans took control of Knossos, ruling over the remaining Minoan population for a time before the palace was ultimately destroyed for good. After 1450 BCE, Minoan culture went into a steep decline and was eventually absorbed by the rising Mycenaean civilization. Their unique art style, their religious beliefs, and their sophisticated palace culture faded away, but they were not entirely forgotten. Their memory was preserved in the powerful Greek myths of King Minos, the labyrinth, and the fearsome Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull monster who lived at the heart of the maze. The labyrinth of the myth is almost certainly a distant memory of the complex, sprawling palace at Knossos. The story of the Athenian hero Theseus sailing to Crete to slay the Minotaur may be a symbolic retelling of the Mycenaean Greek conquest of the island. The Minoans were the brilliant, enigmatic, and ultimately tragic first great civilization of Europe. They created a world of beauty, peace, and prosperity, a Bronze Age utopia that was shattered in an instant, leaving behind only the haunting ruins of their palaces and the undeciphered secrets of their lost language. As the sophisticated, seafaring civilization of the Minoans was flourishing on Crete, a new and very different culture was taking root on the Greek mainland. These were the Mycenaeans, the first Greek-speaking people to establish a major civilization in the Aegean. They were a warlike, ambitious, and hierarchical society of warrior kings, masterful engineers, and long-distance traders who dominated the Greek world from approximately 1600 to 1100 BCE. Theirs is the world described in the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, a world of great heroes like Achilles and Agamemnon, of epic sieges and heroic combat, and of vast wealth measured in gold, bronze, and chariots. For centuries, this was thought to be a world of pure myth until the pioneering excavations of Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century unearthed the stunning reality of this lost civilization. The Mycenaean civilization was not a single, unified empire, but a collection of independent kingdoms centered on fortified palace citadels. The most powerful of these were Mycenae, rich in gold, from which the civilization takes its name, as well as Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and Athens. These citadels were in stark contrast to the open, unfortified palaces of the Minoans. They were military strongholds built on easily defensible hills and protected by immense fortification walls. The walls of Mycenae and Tiryns are so massive, built from enormous, roughly hewn boulders, that later Greeks, believing they could not have been built by human hands, called them Cyclopean walls, attributing their construction to the mythical one-eyed giants. The main entrance to Mycenae, the famous Lion Gate, is a monumental gateway topped by a sculpture of two lions, a powerful symbol of royal authority and military might. At the heart of each Mycenaean citadel was the palace, which served as the administrative and economic center of the kingdom. The focal point of the palace was the Megaon, a large rectangular hall with a central hearth, 4 columns supporting the roof, and a throne for the king, known as the Wainax. The Megaron was a distinctly mainland tradition, a descendant of the chieftain's hall, and it served as the formal throne room, audience chamber, and feasting hall. The walls were decorated with frescoes, but the subject matter was very different from the peaceful, nature-loving art of the Minoans. Mycenaean frescoes depict scenes of warfare, with warriors in boars' tusk helmets wielding figure-8 shields, as well as hunting scenes and formal processions. It was the art of a martial aristocracy. The early wealth of the Mycenaeans is spectacularly demonstrated by the shaft graves discovered at Mycenae by Schliemann. These deep, rectangular burial shafts contained the remains of the early Mycenaean rulers, and they were filled with an astonishing collection of treasures. The deceased were buried with beautifully crafted bronze swords inlaid with gold, and ivory, ceremonial daggers, and vast quantities of gold jewelry. Most famously, their faces were covered with hammered gold death masks. Schliemann, upon discovering one particularly magnificent mask, excitedly declared, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." While we now know the graves predate the likely time of the Trojan War by several centuries, the name has stuck, and the Mask of Agamemnon remains one of the most iconic artifacts of the ancient world. This immense wealth likely came from a combination of sources: trade, mercenary service in the armies of Egypt and the Near East, and outright piracy and raiding. The Mycenaeans were heavily influenced by the more advanced Minoan civilization. They adopted Minoan styles in their art and pottery, their religious iconography, and their administrative practices. Most importantly, they adapted the Minoan writing system to suit their own language. The result was Linear B, a syllabic script that was finally deciphered in 1952 by the brilliant amateur linguist Michael Ventris. The decipherment was a watershed moment, proving that the language of the Mycenaeans was an early form of Greek, and pushing the history of the Greek language back by 700 years. The Linear B tablets, found at Pylos, Knossos, and other sites, are not epic poems or historical chronicles. They are mundane administrative records, inventories of the palace storerooms, lists of livestock, records of land tenure and deployments. Of troops, they record allocations of perfumed oil to various deities, lists of chariot wheels in the palace armory, and the names of different professions, from bronzesmiths to textile workers. While not exciting literature, these tablets provide an invaluable, if incomplete, glimpse into the highly centralized, bureaucratic, and redistributive economy of a Mycenaean kingdom. Everything flowed into the palace to be recorded, and then distributed back out. Mycenaean religion was a precursor to the classical Greek pantheon. The Linear B tablets contain the names of many of the later Olympian gods, including Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Ares, and Artemis, demonstrating the deep roots of Greek religion in the Bronze Age. Poseidon, the god of the sea and earthquakes, appears to have been a particularly important deity, perhaps even more so than Zeus at this early stage. Religious practice involved animal sacrifice and the offering of wine, oil, and other goods at shrines located within the palaces and in the surrounding countryside. By the 14th century BCE, Mycenaean power was at its height. They were a major player in the international politics of the late Bronze Age. Their pottery is found all over the eastern Mediterranean, from Sicily to Syria, indicating the vast extent of their trade network. They exported olive oil, wine, and perfumed oils in distinctive stirrup jars and imported raw materials like copper, tin, and gold. As discussed, it was likely during this period that the Mycenaeans conquered Crete, taking control of the declining Minoan civilization and its lucrative trade routes. This period of expansion and conflict is the historical backdrop for the epic. Tales of Homer, particularly the story of the Trojan War. For centuries, the city of Troy and the war fought over it were considered pure fiction. However, excavations in northwestern Turkey have revealed the ruins of a large and wealthy Bronze Age city that corresponds to the location of Troy, described by Homer. Archaeological evidence shows that the city was destroyed by fire around the same time that the Trojan War would have taken place, in the late 13th century BCE. While the war was almost certainly not fought over the abduction of a beautiful queen, it is highly plausible that the Homeric epic preserves the memory of a real historical conflict, perhaps a series of raids or a major trade war between the Mycenaean Greeks and the powerful city of Troy for control of the sea lanes leading to the Black Sea. But like the other great civilizations of the late Bronze Age, the Mycenaean world came to a sudden and violent end. Between 1200 and 1100 BCE, all the major Mycenaean citadels were destroyed and abandoned. The complex palace-based economy collapsed, writing was forgotten, and Greece entered a dark age that would last for several hundred years. The causes of the Mycenaean collapse are, like the wider Bronze Age collapse, fiercely debated. The traditional explanation was the Dorian invasion, a migration of another group of Greek-speaking people from the north. However, there is little archaeological evidence to support a massive destructive invasion. More likely, the collapse was due to a combination of factors: internal warfare between the rival Mycenaean kingdoms, peasant uprisings against a top-heavy and oppressive palace system, earthquakes, the earth-shaker Poseidon's revenge, climate change and drought, and disruption of the international trade routes that their economy depended on. The Mycenaeans were the first great civilization of mainland Europe. They were the bridge between the earlier, non-Greek world of the Minoans and the later, classical world of the Greeks. They were forgotten for centuries, their magnificent citadels lying in ruins, but their legacy was preserved in the oral traditions that were eventually written down by Homer. These epic tales of heroes, gods, and wars kept the memory of the Bronze Age alive, and they would become the foundational texts of Western literature, inspiring the Greeks of the archaic and classical periods to look back to this lost age of heroes as their own glorious and formative past. At the same time that the great pyramids were rising in Egypt and the cities of Sumer were flourishing in Mesopotamia, another great urban civilization was emerging in a vast territory centered on the Indus River Valley in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. This was the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, after Harappa, one of the first of its cities to be excavated. Flourishing between 2600 and 1900 BCE, it was the most geographically widespread of the three great early civilizations of the Old World, with settlements covering an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Yet it is also the most enigmatic. We know it only through its silent, beautifully planned cities and its thousands of enigmatic artifacts. The Harappans left behind no grand monuments to kings, no depictions of warfare, and, most frustratingly, a beautiful and complex script that remains undeciphered. Theirs is a lost world, a civilization whose political structure, religious beliefs, and even its name have been erased by time. The existence of this vast civilization was completely unknown until the 1920s. The ruins of its major cities had been known for some time, but they were thought to be much later in date. The discovery of distinctive seals with an unknown script, first at Harappa and then at the magnificent site of Mohenjo-Daro, revealed the true antiquity and sophistication of the culture. The Harappan civilization was centered on the rich, fertile floodplains of the Indus River and its tributaries, but its influence extended to the coast of the Arabian Sea and into the foothills of the Himalayas. The people were skilled farmers cultivating wheat, barley, cotton, and dates, and raising livestock including humped zebu cattle. The most remarkable achievement of the Harappan civilization was its urban planning. Their cities were masterpieces of engineering laid out on a grid system with streets oriented to the cardinal directions. The two largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were each divided into two main parts: a raised, fortified citadel to the west and a larger, lower city to the east. The citadel likely contained the main public buildings, such as administrative centers, granaries, and perhaps religious structures. The lower city was the main residential area, with multi-storied houses built from standardized, kill-fired bricks. Up testament to a highly organized system of production. What is most astonishing about these cities is their sophisticated water management system. Many houses had their own private wells and bathrooms with drains that flowed into a complex city-wide network of covered sewers that ran under the streets. This level of municipal sanitation was unparalleled in the ancient world and would not be seen again for thousands of years. This focus on water and cleanliness seems to have been a central feature of Harappan life. At Mohenjo-Daro, the most impressive structure on the citadel is not a palace or a temple, but a large, beautifully constructed public bath known as the Great Bath. This sunken, waterproofed tank was likely used for ritual purification, suggesting that ideas of ritual purity, so central to later Indian religions, may have their roots in this ancient civilization. The uniformity and standardization of Harappan material culture are striking. Across a vast area, cities were built with the same grid layout, using bricks of the same standardized dimensions. They used a uniform system of weights and measures, based on a combination of binary and decimal systems, which has been reconstructed from thousands of beautifully made cubic stone weights. This suggests a high degree of economic integration and centralized control, but the nature of this control is a complete mystery. There is a conspicuous absence of the kind of structures and artifacts that we associate with kingship in Egypt and Mesopotamia. There are no grand palaces, no monumental royal tombs, and no statues or reliefs depicting rulers. The largest buildings seem to be public or communal structures, like the Great Bath and the massive granaries. This has led to a wide range of theories about Harappan political organization. Was it a single, unified empire ruled by a line of anonymous priest kings? Or was it a collection of independent city-states, governed by oligarchies of merchants or priests, who all shared a common culture and ideology? Without deciphered texts, we simply do not know. The art of the Indus Valley is small in scale, but of exceptional quality. The most common and distinctive artifacts are thousands of small square seals, usually made of steatite. These seals are exquisitely carved with realistic depictions of animals, both real and mythological. The most common motif is a creature that looks like a unicorn, but there are also humped bulls, elephants, tigers, and rhinoceroses. Above the animal there is always a line of text in the undeciphered Indus script. These seals were likely used to make impressions on clay tags attached to bundles of goods, serving as marks of ownership or as trade labels. Other notable artworks include a small bronze statue of a graceful, long-limbed dancing girl and a powerful stone bust of a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a patterned robe, often identified as a priest-king. The Indus script itself is one of the great puzzles of archaeology. It consists of around 400 unique symbols, too many for an alphabet but too few for a purely pictographic system, suggesting it is likely a logosyllabic script, similar to Mesopotamian cuneiform. The texts are all extremely short, with an average length of just 5 symbols, making decipherment incredibly difficult. Until a bilingual text, like a Harappan Rosetta Stone, is discovered, the script and the secrets it holds will likely remain locked. The Harappans were active traders. Their seals and pottery have been found at sites in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamian texts from the time of Sargon of Akkad mention a distant land called Meluha, which is widely believed to be the Indus Valley. These texts record the import of wood, copper, gold, and ivory from Meluha, all resources that were abundant in the Indus region. This long-distance sea trade, conducted via the Persian Gulf, was likely a major source of wealth for the Harappan cities. Around 1900 BCE, after 7 centuries of stability and prosperity, the Harappan civilization went into a period of decline. The great cities were gradually abandoned. The standardized system of weights and writing fell out of use, and the society devolved into a more rural, localized culture. The cause of this collapse is another mystery. The old theory, proposed by the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, was that the civilization was destroyed by an invasion of nomadic, Sanskrit-speaking warriors known as the Aryans, who are described in the ancient Hindu texts, the Vedas. However, there is very little archaeological evidence of widespread warfare or destruction. A more likely explanation is environmental change. The Indus Valley civilization was dependent on the regular flooding of the Indus and the seasonal monsoon rains. It is possible that a shift in climate patterns, perhaps a long-term drought or a change in the course of the major rivers, disrupted the agricultural base of the society, leading to famine, social unrest, and the eventual collapse of the urban centers. For nearly 4,000 years, the great cities of the Indus lay buried and forgotten. The rediscovery of the Harappan civilization in the 20th century completely rewrote the history of ancient South Asia. It revealed a sophisticated, peaceful, and highly organized urban culture that was, in many ways, the equal of its more famous contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia. While we cannot read their writing or know the names of their kings, their legacy lives on. Some scholars have suggested that many elements of later Indian culture, such as the practice of yoga, some seals depict figures in yoga-like postures, the worship of sacred animals and trees, and the emphasis on ritual purity may have their origins in this ancient, enigmatic civilization. The Harappans were the forgotten founders of urban life in the Indian subcontinent, a peaceful and orderly people whose silent cities still guard their many secrets. To the east of Sumer and Babylon, across the formidable barrier of the Zagros Mountains, in what is now southwestern Iran, lay the ancient land the Elamites themselves called Haltamte. For nearly 3,000 years, this civilization was the perennial rival, the essential trading partner, and often the most feared enemy of the great Mesopotamian kingdoms. The Elamites were a people with their own distinct language, their own unique pantheon of gods, and their own resilient culture, a powerful kingdom that rose and fell multiple times in a history as long and complex as that of Egypt. They were a shadowy but persistent presence on the eastern fringe of the Near Eastern world, a crucial third pillar in the region's balance of power. While often overshadowed in modern histories by their more famous Mesopotamian neighbors, the Elamites forged a sophisticated and profoundly influential civilization that left behind a unique artistic and cultural legacy, serving as the critical bridge between the worlds of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. The history of Elam is deeply and inextricably intertwined with that of Mesopotamia, a relationship defined by geography. The Elamite heartland was a tale of two landscapes: the hot, fertile lowland plains of Susiana centered on their great capital city of Susa, and the cool, rugged highlands of Anshan, which dominated the Iranian plateau. This duality shaped their identity and their economy. Susa, founded around 4400 BCE, was one of the oldest urban centers in the world, a contemporary of the very first villages of Sumer. Its strategic location made it a vital gateway, controlling the trade routes that funneled the rich resources of the Iranian plateau timber, stone for statues, and valuable metals like copper, lead, and tin down into the resource-poor alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. This made Elam an indispensable, if often troublesome, partner for the Sumerians and Babylonians, who coveted these materials. This dynamic created a complex and often violent relationship, a cyclical pattern of war, conquest, and intense cultural exchange. When the Mesopotamian kingdoms were strong, they would often launch campaigns deep into Elam to secure these resources and neutralize any threat from the east. When the Mesopotamian powers were weak or divided, the Elamites would seize the opportunity to assert their independence, often sweeping down from the highlands to raid deep into Mesopotamian territory, carrying off immense plunder and sometimes shattering entire dynasties. The Elamites were pioneers of writing, developing their own unique script known as Proto-Elamite as early as 3100 BCE, at precisely the same time that writing was being invented in Sumer. This pictographic script, found on clay tablets from Susa, remains undeciphered, another lost language of the ancient world. Later, by the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the Elamites adapted the Mesopotamian cuneiform script to write their own language. Elamite is a linguistic isolate, unrelated to the Semitic languages like Akkadian and Babylonian or the Sumerian language of their neighbors, a fact that underscores their distinct cultural identity. It is through these cuneiform texts, both from Elam and Mesopotamia, that we can piece together the broad outlines of their long and tumultuous history. Elamite history is typically divided into 3 main periods: Old, Middle, and Neo-Elamite. During the Old Elamite period, in the 3rd millennium BCE, they were frequently in conflict with the expansionist empires of Mesopotamia. Sargon of Akkad boasted of his conquests in Elam, and later kings of the Ur-3 dynasty also claimed dominion over Susa. But Elam was never truly subdued. The mountainous terrain of their highland home at Anshan provided a secure refuge from which they could always regroup and reassert their independence. The Middle Elamite period, from roughly 1500 to 1100 BCE, was the golden age of Elamite power and cultural achievement. During this time, a series of powerful kings ruling jointly from the lowland capital of Susa and the highland capital of Anshan forged a strong, unified kingdom. These rulers were not just military commanders, but also great patrons of the arts and architecture. One of the most remarkable and enduring achievements of this period is the magnificent religious complex at Dur-an-Tash, better known today as Chalga-Zanbil, built by the great king Antash-Naparisha around 1250 BCE. This UNESCO World Heritage Site is one of the largest and best preserved ziggurats in the world. It was a monumental undertaking, an artificial mountain of mud brick built to honor the gods Unlike Mesopotamian ziggurats, which were often built on top of older structures, Chalga's anvil was a wholly new creation, designed with a unique internal structure of 5 concentric square levels. It was a federal shrine intended to unify the diverse peoples of the kingdom by bringing together the gods of the lowlands and the highlands into a single pantheon, with the great Elamite god Inshushinak and the Mesopotamian god Naparisha honored. At the summit, Elamite religion had its own unique character, although it was heavily influenced by Mesopotamia over time. The early pantheon was dominated by goddesses, most notably Pinakir, the Great Mother goddess. However, over time, male gods came to prominence. The supreme deity was often seen as a triad consisting of a chief god, like Humban, a consort goddess, and their son. The most important god in practice, however, was Inshushinak, the powerful and revered patron god of the capital city, Susa. Like the Mesopotamian god Nergal, Inshushinak was the lord of the underworld and the solemn judge of the dead. Elamite. Art is also highly distinctive. While borrowing Mesopotamian motifs, it possesses a unique liveliness and naturalism. The Elamites were master metallurgists, and one of the great treasures of world art is the near life-size bronze statue of Queen Napir-Asu, the wife of Untash-Napirisha. The statue, now in the Louvre, has a solid bronze core with a copper shell and weighs over 1,750 kilograms. It was made to be an eternal, indestructible prayer for the queen, and its sophisticated casting technology was unparalleled for its time. A particularly fascinating aspect of Elamite society was its system of royal succession. Power was not always transferred in a simple patrilineal line from father to son. Instead, it was often filtered through a complex system with strong matrilineal features. The ideal path to kingship was to first marry the previous king's daughter. Power often passed from a king to his brother, and then to the son of his sister. This frequently led to a system of co-regency, or even a triumvirate of rulers, the Sukoma, or over-king, who likely resided at Susa, his brother, the viceroy of Susa, and their nephew, the king's sister's son, the prince of Susa. This complex system was likely designed to balance power between different branches of the royal family and between the lowland and highland regions, but it was also a source of frequent internal power struggles and instability. The absolute peak of Elamite military power came in the 12th century BCE under the aggressive king Shutruk-Nahant and his sons. At a time when the Kassite dynasty of Babylon was weak and decadent, the Elamites saw their chance. They launched a devastating invasion of Mesopotamia, marching all the way to the capital, Babylon. They sacked the great city, plundered its temples and palaces, and carried off its most sacred treasures as war booty. Among the looted trophies they brought back in triumph to Susa was the cult statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, a profound act of humiliation, and most famously, the magnificent diorite stele containing the law code of Hammurabi. It was in the ruins of Susa that French archaeologists discovered this iconic Babylonian monument in 1901, a silent testament to this brief but glorious moment of Elamite supremacy. Shutruk-Nahant left his own inscription on the stele, boasting of his conquest. "I am Shutruk-Nahant, king of Elam. By the will of Inshushinak I destroyed Babylon. I took the stele of Hammurabi and brought it back to Elam. This triumph, however, was to be short-lived. A new and energetic Babylonian, King Nebuchadnezzar I, rose to power, determined to avenge his city's humiliation. He drove the Elamites out of Mesopotamia and launched a daring counter-invasion of Elam. In a surprise attack during the hottest part of the summer, he defeated the Elamite army, sacked Susa, and recovered the stolen statue of Marduk. This crushing defeat marked the end of the Middle Elamite period and set Elam into a long period of decline and obscurity that lasted for nearly 300 years. They re-emerged as a major regional power in the Neo-Elamite period from the 8th century BCE onwards, but they found themselves in a far more dangerous world. They were now caught between two new and immensely powerful empires, the brutal Neo-Assyrian Empire to the west and the rising power of the Medes and Persians on the Iranian plateau to the east. The Elamites attempted to survive by skillfully playing these powers against each other, frequently supporting Babylonian rebellions against Assyrian rule. This policy ultimately proved fatal, bringing down the full vengeful wrath of the Assyrian war machine. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, determined to crush Elam once and for all and put an end to their meddling, launched a series of brutal campaigns in the mid-7th century BCE. In 646 BCE, he captured and utterly destroyed the city of Susa, Ashurbanipal's. Victory inscriptions record the event with chilling satisfaction. Susa, the great holy city. I conquered. I entered its palaces, I opened their treasuries where silver and gold, goods and wealth were amassed. I destroyed the ziggurat of Susa. I smashed its shining copper horns. I reduced the temples of Elam to naught. Their gods and goddesses I scattered to the winds, the tombs of their ancient and recent kings. I devastated, I exposed to the sun, and I carried away their bones toward the land of Ashur. I devastated the provinces of Elam, and on their lands I sowed salt. This devastating blow and the symbolic act of sowing the land with salt to ensure its eternal barrenness effectively ended Elam as an independent political entity. Although their kingdom was annihilated, the Elamite people and their culture endured. When the Persians, an Indo-European people from the Elamite highlands of Anshan, established the great Achaemenid Empire a century later, they did so as the heirs of Elam. The founder of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great, even styled himself King of Anshan. The Persians showed great respect for the Elamite legacy. Susa was rebuilt and became one of the 4 administrative capitals of the vast Persian Empire, a favorite winter residence for kings like Darius and Xerxes. The Elamite language, for a time, continued to be used as one of the 3 official languages of the empire, alongside Old Persian and Babylonian, as seen on the famous trilingual Behistun inscription of Darius the Great. The Persians adopted and adapted many elements of Elamite art, administrative practices, and court ceremony. In many ways, the Persian Empire was a direct successor to the Elamite kingdom, a final triumph of the Iranian plateau over Mesopotamia. The Elamites were the forgotten 3rd pillar of the ancient Near East, a shadowy but powerful kingdom whose long and complex history is a crucial part of the story of the ancient world. In the northern part of Mesopotamia, on a plateau overlooking the Tigris River, arose a civilization that would perfect the art of empire and become one of the most feared and formidable military powers in all of history. Assyria, named for their chief god Ashur and their ancient sacred capital city of the same name. The Assyrians were a hardy, Semitic-speaking people who, through centuries of struggle and ruthless adaptation, transformed themselves from a small city-state of traders into a brutally efficient and seemingly unstoppable imperial machine. For over 200 years during the Neo-Assyrian period, they dominated the entire Near East with an iron fist, conquering an empire that stretched from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean, and even for a time subjugating the ancient kingdom of Egypt itself. They built an empire based on calculated terror, mass deportation, and overwhelming military force, an empire of fear that left a deep and permanent scar on the memory of the ancient world, and whose methods would become a dark blueprint for imperial domination for ages to come. The history of Assyria is long and complex, stretching back to the 3rd millennium BCE. For much of their early history, during the Old and Middle Assyrian periods, they were a relatively minor power, a small kingdom often dominated by their more powerful neighbors to the south, like the Akkadians and the Babylonians of Hammurabi's dynasty. Their early wealth was not based on conquest, but on commerce. From their capital at Ashur, Assyrian merchants established a sophisticated long-distance trading network, most notably with central Anatolia. They set up merchant colonies, or harems, in major Anatolian cities, the most important being at Kanish. Here, they traded Assyrian textiles and Mesopotamian tin, a vital component for making bronze for Anatolian silver and copper. Thousands of clay tablets from the harem at Kanish, representing the business archives of these merchant families, provide a remarkably detailed picture of this early capitalist enterprise, with contracts, letters of credit, and records of profit and loss. The defining characteristic of Assyria's geography, however, was its profound vulnerability. Unlike Babylonia, which was protected by vast deserts and marshes, or Egypt, which was insulated by the sea and the desert, the Assyrian heartland was an open and exposed plateau. It was constantly under threat from hostile peoples in the surrounding Zagros Mountains to the east and the steppes to the north. This constant existential pressure forged the Assyrians into a tough, pragmatic, and intensely militaristic society. For them, warfare was not a choice, but a matter of survival. They lived in a dangerous neighborhood, and over centuries, they learned to be more organized, more disciplined, and far more ruthless than any of their enemies. Their entire state became a weapon. This evolution culminated in the Neo-Assyrian Empire from approximately 911 to 609 BCE, a series of ambitious, energetic, and brilliant kings, starting with figures like Ashur-Nisirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III, began a relentless program of military expansion. The Assyrian army was the most advanced, complex, and effective fighting force the world had yet seen. At its core was a large, well-trained, and lavishly equipped standing army of professional soldiers, paid and supplied by the state. They were the first true masters of siege warfare, a crucial skill for conquering the heavily fortified cities of the Near East. They developed a fearsome arsenal of siege engines, including massive iron-tipped battering rams housed in armored mobile sheds, multi-storied siege towers that could be rolled up to the city walls, allowing archers to clear the ramparts, and teams of sappers who would tunnel under enemy walls to undermine their foundations. Their field army was a sophisticated combined arms force. The infantry consisted of units of heavily armored spearmen who fought in tight formations, mobile archers who could lay down a withering fire, and slingers. They also perfected the use of cavalry, with mounted archers and lancers who were far more flexible than the chariot corps of the Bronze Age. Chariots were still used, but primarily as command vehicles and for shock tactics against wavering enemy lines. The Assyrian war machine was a testament to superb organization, logistics, and engineering, an unstoppable force that crushed all who stood in its way. But the Assyrians' most potent weapon was psychological warfare. They understood that it was more efficient to make an enemy surrender without a fight than to undertake a costly siege. To this end, they deliberately and systematically cultivated a reputation for extreme, almost psychopathic, cruelty and terror. Their kings boasted in their royal annals and commissioned vast, detailed narrative reliefs on the walls of their palaces that depicted in graphic detail the horrific punishments they inflicted on rebellious cities. The reliefs from the palace of Assurnaserpal II at Nimred are a masterclass in horror. They show enemies being impaled on stakes outside their city walls, prisoners being flayed alive, their skin hung up for display, and piles of severed heads being stacked like trophies. These were not idle threats. They were a calculated policy of frightfulness, or Schrecklichkeit, designed to crush the will of their enemies and discourage any thought of resistance. Another key pillar of Assyrian imperial policy was the practice of mass deportation on an unprecedented scale. After conquering a region, they would forcibly deport huge segments of the population, often the educated elites, the scribes, the priests, and the skilled craftsmen, and resettle them in other parts of the empire. This had a dual purpose. It broke the spirit of the conquered people, shattered their local identity, and severed their connection to their ancestral lands, making future rebellions less likely. It also provided a massive pool of skilled labor for the Assyrians' colossal building projects and helped to populate the agricultural lands around their capitals. This policy is famously described in the Bible, which recounts the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, and the deportation of its population, who became known to history as the 10 Lost Tribes. This empire was governed by a highly centralized and efficient bureaucracy headed by the king. The king of Assyria was not just a monarch. He was the absolute ruler and the chief priest of the national god Ashur. The expansion of the empire was seen as the expansion of the god's domain, a sacred duty to bring the world under the ordered rule of Ashur. The empire was divided into provinces, each ruled by a governor who answered directly to the king. A sophisticated network of royal roads, with a system of messengers on horseback and way stations, a system the later Persians would famously adopt and expand, allowed for rapid communication between the capital and the furthest reaches of the empire. Through this system, the immense wealth of the conquered lands, tribute in the form of gold, silver, horses, grain, and slaves poured into the Assyrian heartland. This wealth funded the army and the construction of magnificent new capital cities like Nimrud, Khorsabad, and the most famous of all, Nineveh. Nineveh, under the last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, reigned 668 to 627 BCE, became the largest and most magnificent city in the world at the time. It was a city of monumental palaces with their terrifying reliefs, soaring temples, and lush irrigated gardens. Ashurbanipal, though as ruthless in war as his predecessors, was a complex figure, a great patron of culture and learning. He was one of the few kings of his time who was fully literate, and he was driven by a scholarly passion to collect and preserve all the knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia. He sent his scribes throughout his empire, especially to the ancient cities of Babylonia, to gather and copy tens of thousands of cuneiform texts. These included religious incantations, scientific observations, medical texts, dictionaries, and literary works. The result was the great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the first systematically collected and catalogued library in history. The discovery of the remains of this library in the 19th century was a watershed moment in the rediscovery of the ancient Near East. It is thanks to Ashurbanipal's scholarly obsession that we have our most complete and coherent versions of seminal works like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. But the Assyrian Empire, built on a foundation of brutal oppression, constant warfare, and economic exploitation, was inherently unstable. It was a structure under immense internal pressure. The resources required to maintain its massive army and control its vast, resentful population were staggering. Its calculated cruelty had won it no friends, only bitter enemies who were waiting for any sign of weakness. That moment came after the death of the great Ashurbanipal, when the empire was weakened by a series of bloody civil wars between his less capable successors. Seeing their chance, a coalition of two of their most subjugated peoples rose in a great rebellion. These were the Babylonians from the south under their new king Nabopolassar, and the Medes, an Indo-Iranian people from the Zagros Mountains under their king Cyaxares. In 612 BCE, their combined armies besieged and conquered the great city of Nineveh. The Assyrians, who had sown so much terror across the world, were now the victims of it. The mighty city was looted, burned, and so utterly destroyed that its very location was lost to history for over 2,000 years. The fall of Assyria was swift, total, and final. The empire collapsed, and the Assyrian people were largely absorbed into the succeeding empires of the Babylonians and the Persians. Their cataclysmic fall was celebrated throughout the ancient world as an act of divine justice. The biblical prophet Nahum exulted, "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims." All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall, for who has not felt your unending cruelty? Yet the Assyrian legacy, for all its darkness, was a powerful one. They had created the largest, most complex, and most efficiently administered empire the world had yet seen. Their administrative systems, their military organization, and their imperial ideology would be a model for all subsequent empires in the region, including the Persians, who learned so much from them. And in the ruins of their great library, they unintentionally preserved the priceless cultural heritage of Mesopotamia for posterity, a final, ironic act of creation from an empire built on destruction. Our long journey through the mists of time into the world before the glory of Greece now comes to an end. We have seen that the lands of the ancient world were not a dark, empty stage awaiting the arrival of the Hellenes, but a vibrant and crowded arena of forgotten giants. We began in the dust and heat of Mesopotamia, where the ingenious Sumerians first built cities, looked to the heavens, and pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, giving humanity the gift of writing and the burden of history. We saw their world conquered and unified by the Akkadians under Sargon, who forged the very concept of empire, an ideal of universal rule that would echo for millennia. From the ashes of that empire, Babylon rose, and with it Hammurabi, who gave the world its first great public declaration that a king's power rests not just on might, but on justice and written law. We traveled to the rugged hills of Anatolia, where the Hittite warrior diplomats built an empire of iron and treaties, their chariots thundering across the plains to clash with the armies of Pharaoh, a forgotten superpower that stood as an equal to Egypt. From the shores of the Levant we set sail with the Phoenicians, the purple people of the sea, who built no great land empire, but connected the entire Mediterranean with their ships, their goods, and their most revolutionary invention, the simple, elegant alphabet that you are reading today. We ventured to the island of Crete and walked the labyrinthine halls of the Minoans, a graceful, artistic people who created a peaceful maritime civilization, a Bronze Age paradise lost to volcano and invasion. From there, we crossed to the Greek mainland, to the mighty Cyclopean walls of the Mycenaeans, the first Greeks, the age of heroes whose real exploits and treasures became the stuff of myth and the foundation of Western literature. Further east, we glimpsed the silent, orderly cities of the Indus Valley, a civilization of astonishing scale and sophistication, yet so enigmatic that we do not know the names of their kings or the meaning of their words. We uncovered the Shadowy, kingdom of Elam, the resilient and perpetual rival of Mesopotamia, a bridge to the Iranian world whose history is a testament to cultural endurance. And finally, we faced the terrible might of Assyria, the empire of fear, whose brutal war machine and calculated terror created the largest dominion the world had yet seen, but whose king's obsession with knowledge accidentally saved the literature of the civilizations they conquered. Each of these forgotten empires was a world unto itself, with its own gods, its own triumphs, its own tragedies. Yet their stories are not separate. They are interwoven threads in a single vast tapestry. They traded with one another, fought with one another, and learned from one another. Technologies like the wheel and writing, ideas about law and kingship, and the tales of gods and heroes flowed between them. They were the ancestors of the world that the Greeks inherited. The Greek miracle was not a spontaneous generation, but the brilliant flowering of seeds that had been planted and cultivated for 3,000 years in the fertile soil of these older, forgotten civilizations. The names of their kings are now obscure, their languages are silent, and their great cities are mounds of earth. But their legacy is all around us, embedded in our laws, our letters, our stories, and our very concept of what it means to live in a civilized world. Their fires have long since turned to embers, but from those embers new light was kindled, and it is by that light that we continue to find our way. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet grandeur of these lost worlds.